Now, I think that completes my relatives and names. Shall we go to the next question?
I guess so. Okay. All right. Maybe I'll come back to that because you were real good and thorough. Maybe that's what they want. Maybe I should be more thorough on some of mine.
I don't think it makes any.
Both recall a favorite childhood memory that includes near or distant relatives. Well, when I think of childhood memories, I think of a couple things. One being, there were many years when it was my sister and myself and Doll. And the aunts Edna and Tress were very prevalent in our little circle. And even as we got older, they were very close to me. And they were sort of the organizers of great family picnics. Maybe that would not be held annually, but maybe every 2 or 3 years. And they would get together all the Kelleher clan, let's say. And we did. We had good times. And so those were good memories. And then another fond memory is when Papa became our dad. I was probably in about 1st or 2nd grade. And we lived out in Osborn. And when he came, along came a lot of nice toys for little girls. Because Mary Lloyd was about 4 then. And we had, which we'd never had before, right? And so we had a nice backyard out there in Osborn, and before I knew it, it was filled with a sandbox and a tent. And also 2 bicycles. And that was a good time. We'd never had anything like that. And we thought that tent was really great. We'd go in and play house and all that kind of stuff in the sandbox. We had a lot of good times those summers. So Papa brought a nice rounding to our life. Those were good times. How about you?
All finished? Well, one of the advantages of going second, you get to think about it a little longer. Question, and there's a lot of favorite childhood memories. Of course, in the immediate family, those stand out. That is, with the memories with your own father and mother and the times that you had with them. And I think probably you always think of Christmas times and the good times you had there. My father was very successful in his work, and even though we grew up in the 30s, so it's just the height of the Depression, he always had a job and was able to provide a nice home and a very comfortable living for his family, and which included very nice Christmases. But I guess the favorite memories are of our vacations together when we were all a family. And probably the one that stands out is a trip we took down to Florida in the 30s. And playing on the beach, and at Christmas time it was. And living that was one of the first big vacations I can remember. There were many others, but that was one of my favorite childhood memories. I also had some good childhood memories from my near relatives that would be really more than I think that take up more time than the camera would allow.
Trips to Cincinnati and stuff.
Trips to Cincinnati.
Yeah. How many times did you go down?
One of my favorite memories, I guess, was I was staying with my Aunt Cots, with my mother's sister, sitting on her front porch in an old section. Although at that time this was the 30s, so this house then was about 50 years old. It was built before the turn of the century. And she'd sit on the front porch and rock and tell stories, ghost stories, to me. And one of the favorite stories was the voice that was heard in the house at all times, and that voice said, "It floats. It floats." And the punchline was always the same. It was ivory soap that floats.
Oh.
Procter & Gamble were promoting ivory soap then, but I just love to hear her tell that story about it floats. It floats.
So any subject matter would end up with ivory soap as the
Ivory
punchline.
soap was the punchline. Always the same punchline. I was easily amused. You could see it.
How old were you?
Well, I must have been about, I don't know, 4 or 5 years old, something like that. I do remember one time we were sitting there on the front porch, and an old lady walked by with a heavy burden with packages, or with carrying bags. We call her a bag lady now, if we saw her. She had 2 bags, one in each hand. She was trudging along. Aunt Cotts got up and rushed down to her, and she said, "Come on, Bill, we'll help this lady carry her bags home." And we did. We carried her bags for about 3 blocks. I didn't carry them, but I just walked alongside, and she carried them. We took this old lady's stuff home, to her home. And that was just the way Aunt Cotts was.
Always helps some people.
Shall we go on to the next
All
question?
right. You want to read that one?
The next question. Describe something you would consider significant that you learned from your grandparents.
Well, I did not know my grandparents on my mother's side. I would hear stories. And the stories I would hear about Dan and Mary Kelleher were people, it seemed to me like a mother who did a lot of work around the house organizing the girls, because I think, let's see, they had 6 girls and 1 boy. Jobs were every Saturday, and I thought, that woman was organized. I guess she had to be for that many children. And Grandpa was a fireman, and he was sort of the calming influence. I think there were stories about how there would be storms and so forth, and Grandma and the girls would get all excited and so forth, and nervous about thunderstorms and lightning and thunder and so forth, and to offset that, he would sit on the front porch in his rocking chair and right in the middle of a thunderstorm and just show the girls that there was nothing to be fearful of. I don't know if any of them believed it or not, but that's one thing I remember those stories about Grandma and Grandpa. And then Grandma McGuire and Grandpa McGuire, I visited them a couple times in Cleveland, Ohio. And we did make several trips at Christmas time. In particular, I remember going up and visiting them. And I remember how the car used to be so cold in the wintertime, and the heaters never worked like they do nowadays. And Mary Lloyd and I'd be just all knotted up in the back seat trying to keep warm. And we'd finally get there, and we'd be so happy. And we always had a good time up there. Grandma had a nice meal for us and good times. And but I felt I never really knew them because I didn't see them that often, really. So I don't have a lot. And I never did meet my Lloyd Hunning's grandparents. We lost touch with them. I would say, I'm not sure when Doll did, but I never did hear too much about them. How about you? You probably have lots of memories.
Well, I might start off by saying I too have very little memory of my grandparents. My maternal grandparents died around 1926, before I could have known them, and so did my paternal grandparent. The only one I really remember is my father's mother, Grandma Kamp.
Maybe part of that reason was because both of our mothers were the youngest in the family by the time they got married. I don't know. I know Doll was probably 30 or so when she was married. She was older. I don't know. How old was your mother?
That's right.
So they were The youngest
They were my parents were the youngest in their families, and their parents were quite old when they were married. I do like you. I remember my stories of my maternal grandparents. John was a very enterprising guy, and he would get into business deals and exasperate my grandmother, and she always was after my grandfather for some of the things he did, and I guess it was quite amusing, but it sort of told their life together, these stories about her. He would, when he moved from Mount Washington, he picked out a house that, before she even saw it. She used to tell him, you want your daughters to grow up in this house and in this neighborhood. If anything happens to them, it's your fault, you know.
That type of thing.
But actually, they grew up quite well there. And, although my Aunt Mary married a fellow down the street, and he was a Presbyterian, and she really got after my grandfather. To see what you're doing, you it's all your fault, John Kilduff, that your daughter's going out and marrying this guy. And my Uncle Frank, he was the Presbyterian, turned out to be a wonderful man and a wonderful husband, and one of my favorite uncles, and I'll always remember him.
That's cute.
And he was good to Mary, and he took her to Mass every Sunday without fail, and he never interfered with her practice. And just before he died, he became a Catholic.
That was like 2 years or so, wasn't it, or so, because he went to church then with Aunt Mary the last couple of years, didn't he?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
My grandfather on my father's side was a slightly built fellow, and his wife, who was my grandmother, Mary was her name, was sort of a domineering type, and she ruled the family with an iron fist. And the one memory that comes from him was told to me by my own mother. She said she would, when she first met Clarence and would visit their house, my grandfather would always come over to Eleanor and say, "Do you want to split one?" And this, of course, he meant split a beer. Each of them drink part of the bottle of beer. But he always had a big stock of bananas out in the kitchen. You always go out and get yourself a banana off the stock.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
And my grandmother, who I do remember, was quite a portly woman. She was a good cook, and it was evidenced by her girth. She came from a very fine family in Cincinnati, and was a hardworking German woman.
German, and that's how we used to say it too.
Yeah, they both were from Germany. Both my grandfather and grandmother came here from Germany. Though they were born here they were born in Cincinnati, but their parents came from Germany. Well, I think that.
Well, along that line, I have a story. It ties in with grandparents, but it's noteworthy, I think, in that it was during the flood that took place in Dayton, the famous Dayton flood. Now, I don't know if that...
1914.
14, was it? Okay.
Or 19...
13, I thought.
1913.
13. And they lived on Finley Street. This is Grandma and Grandpa Kelleher and their family. And so they knew the flood was coming. So my mother was going to make her first communion. And she had this pretty communion dress that I think Aunt Tress made for her. Because Tress was the seamstress of the family. And she was one of the older sisters. And so my mother just loved this pretty dress. So she grabbed that dress and went up to the second story of the house on Finley Avenue and just sat up there waiting to see what the flood was going to do. She wanted to save not only herself but her dress. And but they escaped without much problem. And but some of their friends and neighbors weren't as lucky because their homes were damaged. And the Kellehers were very giving people. They took a lot of their neighbors and friends in and could stay at their house. So I do remember stories of Grandma Kelleher and them being very generous in opening up their house to people. And in those days also, like tramps used to come and knock at the back door. And Grandma Kelleher always gave them a full meal. Whoever came to that door, she gave them a full meal. And, you know, that's how you sort of fed the poor. In those days, they just knocked on the door.
The government didn't take care of them then, did
That's
it?
right. And I can remember that myself when I was a little kid.
They fed you when you came to the back door.
Yeah, right. when a poor person would knock at the back door, Mother would give them food, so she passed it on what her mother had done for. But do you ever remember
I don't remember
beggars
anybody
knocking at the door?
knocking at our back doors.
Yeah. Well, I guess they knew which house to hit, didn't they?
Why don't you read the next question?
Okay,